Good morning and good afternoon and good evening, everybody. My name is Christina Baxter, and myself and Scott Hartley just joined. We will be providing you with this webinar today. And just for a little bit of background, I own a company called Emergency Response Tips, and I work closely with Scott, who is the CEO of Proengin USA. And so we have been doing this series of webinars now for a couple of years, where we try to just bring free webinars out to everybody about detection and not only focusing in on the Proengin products, but all the products out there to make sure that you're optimizing the toolbox that you have available to you. So today we're going to talk about some of the current events that are happening around the world and how you can use the detectors in your toolbox to help you address those. So we are just focusing on detection today, whereas last month we did a bit of decon and things as well. So today it's just about detection. I am going to turn it over to Scott to introduce himself and to kick this off. Thanks.
Good morning or good afternoon or way late at night for some of you. So it's very nice to meet you. So my name is Scott, the CEO of Proengin Inc. So yeah, today we thought this would be a very good webinar to kind of go through from the standpoint of to kind of hit some of the current things that are out there. So these are things that in some cases have occurred over the last month or two. So everything's kind of fairly pertinent, but these are things that first responders could likely see either from accidental suicides or purposeful events. So we kind of wanted to talk through those and how you respond to those as well. So I think what we can do to make it a little bit easier, you can put up the slides. You can probably drop off the webcam. See, as much as you probably like looking at me, you don't have to. The slides are much better. So we can go ahead and start that. I just have to get my fingers to work properly here, and we can go ahead and start. So first we wanted to do an introduction kind of just of the basic technologies that we're going to be talking about today from this. So this is a slide that we like to use fairly commonly, but there is a difference between trace and bulk detection methods that are out there from the standpoint of trace detection are a lot of times used to, they're kind of first in technology. So they're used to identify source. They have a fairly quick response time in the matter of seconds to tens of seconds. They're mostly continuous sampling solutions, and they're lightweight and easier to carry. And they tend to be lower, less expensive technologies because in some cases, if it's a really nasty thing you're dealing with, that might be the last time you're using that equipment, just because it's pretty expensive, or especially if you're doing something nasty that you can't guarantee it can be fully decon to be able to do that. But the original parts of kind of your trace detection are your first in, quick figure out where the source of it's located, the concentration, gather as much operational information that you can use from it, and then as well as a lot of times to create or collect a good sample out of that. And then you move it to your bulk detection method. So your bulk detection methods, they're primarily running, they're using different methods, but technologies would be like FTIR, Raman, high pressure mass spec, GC mass spec. So what they're going to do is run full spectrum and comparing that spectrum to a database. And so they're used for identification and verification of the identification with us. A lot of your trace detection methodologies will give you indications, but they won't give you an actual verification of that. So they'll tell you, get you around the pathway of where you need to go, but they won't be able to do that. Plus, this is just a general rule. You want to have verification from multiple detector systems. So for example, if you're going to be shutting down an interstate due to something nasty there, you want to have the answer for multiple detectors, right? Because if you're wrong, that could be not the most enjoyable conversation to have with the people that are upset at you for doing that. Additional thing with your bulk detectors, they tend to be much more expensive, so you don't really want to bring them down in range, or they tend to be bigger with them. So there's a little bit of a misnomer out there from the standpoint of bulk detection methods. You can bring a small amount or a trace amount of material to do the detection. So this is one area where the English language may not necessarily be the best choice for that, but as a general rule, what we're talking about is batch samples versus continuous type samples to be able to do there. So we're going to primarily focusing in on kind of the trace detection. We will be discussing some of the bulk detection methods today from the sample of this, but we wanted to kind of go through on like a first responder where you're dealing with unknowns or different types of situations where you need to be quickly responding, how you use the appropriate tools that you have associated with them. So next slide, please. So first, what we're going to do is talk about the AP4C or flame spectroscopy. So I have a short video here that kind of walks through how the system's used in operating. So what you see inside the detector is there's a small flame and air is continuously pulled through the device. On the front of the device, before the flame's actually occurring, you have a front chamber, and what that's used is kind of similar to a silencer on a weapon. It keeps if you're dealing with flammable materials, it keeps any flame from propagating outside of the combustion chamber. So it kind of acts as a dampener and keeps that flame from going on there. So what you're seeing here is you're pulling the airstream through, and how the process works is the flame, what it does is it excites materials, and certain materials will produce visible light. So what happens is the atoms come in, they get excited, and as they relax after exposure to the flame, they produce visible light. So what we do is we capture that visible light through an optical lens, and then we use CMOS technology. So CMOS technology allows you to take light and turn it into electrons that you can then analyze with a processor. So what we're looking for is the specific fingerprint of the response coming from different elements. And that response, another nice thing about it is it's specific to those elements and those elements only. So each element has a unique and distinguishable response. And then as well, the more atoms that are present, the more light that's produced. So it's both a quantitative and a qualitative method to being able to identify materials with high accuracy. So the way I like to describe it is that you're doing truncated spectroscopy. So you're getting the accuracy, kind of your GC mass spec, which is kind of your gold standard out there, but you're doing it real time. And instead of looking for thousands of ways,
Scott, just lost your sound. Quick question, did anybody else lose Scott? If you could send me a note in the chat, Gautier or somebody. Otherwise, I'll just pick up. Otherwise, I don't want to be over talking him.
What?
There you are.
Okay. Yeah, I was just waiting for the next slide. It didn't show up yet. There we go. So one of the things that we're going to be talking about today are sampling methods. So one of the challenges that we have is especially if you're dealing with a low vapor pressure material and or if it's cold outside in particular, there's not much vapor to be able to do that. So anytime you're sampling vapors, what you want to try and do is bring the detector as close as you can to that sample and leave it there for a while. If there's not many atoms that are coming off or off-gassing off that device, the detectors can still work. A lot of times it just may take a little bit of time. Now, the AP4C, one nice thing about it is that it's sampling continuously and giving you an output every 2 seconds. So it's a very fast responding time, but there are other technologies which take a little bit longer, and we'll talk a little bit about that. So you always want to try to just hold it there and be patient right near a sample and try and get the information coming off of the sample, because that's going to give you the most operationally relevant information, because it's going to tell you relative to concentrations and the levels that are present with that. If that doesn't work, we go to option number 2. So this is headspace capturing method. So what the headspace method is you capture something to keep the airflow around there. So if it's a windy day, you're outside. Sometimes there just may not be enough. The atoms are there, but they're just blowing by very fast. So the headspace method allows the concentration to increase, and then you can open that up, sample it from there, and get the information on the materials and their concentration. And then the third option is you can actually take a sample. So the AP4C system has a sampling method. And so you have a scraper, and then what that does is you take a sample and then you apply heat. So you're increasing the the number of atoms that will release from the system, you'll be able to pick those up into the device. And then cancel the option number 3, it's more you're looking for indicative information.
Okay, I think we're losing Scott again here. So on option number 3, we end up having the thermal desorption of the material straight into the interface. The only issue that we have with option number 3 is that we end up having less quantitative measures, but still plenty of quantitative measure, and we'll get into that further.
And this is just a further explanation of kind of what's going on inside when we're doing the headspace. So the diagram on the left is what happens by putting a sample on there is you actually will start to get some buildup eventually, and then there's actually start to be some condensation that occurs back into the liquid form. So that what that does is that increases the pressure and the amount of materials that are present. And then when we talked as well about the material being able to go further up into the system is also helpful to be able to, you're applying more heat to the system. And so by applying more heat, you're able to get more energy out of the device. Are you hearing me okay?
Right now we are, yeah.
Okay, sorry, I don't know what happened there. In regards to the next technology we're going to look at are PIDs. So what a PID does is it uses a UV light to irradiate a sample. So the sample is pulled through there. So the different UV lights, and we'll talk a little bit about that. So what happens, the UV light ionizes the materials, and then it goes over a series of 2 plates. So the plates have an electric potential that's applied to them. And then what the instrument's doing is measuring the current. So as certain materials pass by, if they've been excited by the lamp, then a current will be produced. So you're able to the amount of current is directly measured to the amount of ionized materials that are present with there. Now, there are different types of lamps that'll work for different types of materials. So the most common one is your 10.6 lamp. So in that case, that's your most common, and it's the one that will last pretty long. And it also gives you a fair number of materials. There are certain materials where they just aren't able to be accessed from that. So for example, hydrogen cyanide and chlorine aren't able to. You know, in the case of chlorine, you can get it higher at the 11.7 lamp to be able to do that. So one of the things with this technology, it's a really good, it's another fast responding technology, but it does have a lot of cross sensitivity. So that ionization, so multiple materials can reproduce that same response in there. So it's important to understand if you are dealing with cross sensitivity of those materials, that you understand what those cross sensitivities are, so you aren't using the material with that. As well as if you're having a mixture of multiple materials present in that airstream, you will get multiple responses from that as well. So you just have to be careful with that. But a PID is a really good response in a machine to use to be able to sample and quickly identify and understand concentrations of materials.
And then I'll go over the electrochemical cells here. And what's happening with the electrochemical cell, I like to explain this as if it's no different than the way your batteries work. So when you start looking at this, you have 2 different electrodes. You have your measuring electrode and you have your reference electrode. And as the material comes in, it has to move through some type of electrolyte in between those 2 electrodes. And that is the movement, and the speed of movement is what gives the signal at the end. So you end up with a signal that is changed into a voltage, and that voltage is giving you an answer. Now, we have to remember that electrochemical cells have a lot of cross sensitivities. I like to use those cross sensitivities to my benefits. We'll talk a little bit about cross sensitivities here. One of the most common ones that we use a lot today is the carbon monoxide cross sensitivity for hydrogen, where we know that we can measure hydrogen gas using a carbon monoxide electrochemical cell. And it makes it provide us with more benefit as long as we're looking around the situation and ruling out other hazards. So you can get, just like a battery, positive and negative energy. And so when you think of your negative cross sensitivity, I like to think of that as I'm recharging my battery. So the electrons are moving in the opposite direction. Now, the biggest problem that we do have with electrochemical cells, I don't consider cross sensitivities a problem as long as I understand them. But the problem comes in is the response times. So while you start to see answers almost immediately on your electrochemical cells, you will have delays to the point where it's quantitative. So, for example, carbon monoxide I already brought up. The response time on a carbon monoxide sensor is 30 seconds. So while you'll see that carbon monoxide starting to rise, the quantitative measure, where you can actually take that number and use that to make a decision, doesn't occur until 30 seconds after you've taken that sample. So you've got to be really careful about where you're moving and knowing where that sample reading is coming from. This becomes really critical when you're talking about something like hydrogen cyanide, where your response time to where you're getting a quantitative measure is 200 seconds. So 3.5 minutes after you took the sample. And so we have to also remember that with things like ammonia, you should have a 60-second lag. So what's going to happen here is if you're using your AP4C with a 2-second response time, and you're using your PID with a 2 to 3 second response time, and your ammonia sensor, you need to read them at different time periods. And this becomes really critical so that when we start looking at numbers, we're actually going to use the numbers from the PID and from the AP4C because they're going to provide us with a really fast response time. We'll use the ammonia one to follow up. This is one of the reasons I like to use a lot of my electrochemical cells when I'm doing area monitoring, because I can leave them in place and look at trends versus something where I'm trying to set zones or something of that nature where I want something really fast. So this one's just to show you the response time a little bit. So the AP4C is going to be our fastest one. And then we end up with our PID should have come off right after it. Let's see if it's actually not going. Let me see. Oh, they didn't go. It didn't work on this system. So the AP4C and the PID will come out just around 2 and 3 seconds. The JCAT in its survey mode, as long as you're measuring a pretty high level, will come out around the same. Indicating papers, your pH paper, M8 paper, all of those things also come out around that period. And then the JCAT using standard mode will come out closer to around 6 to 7 seconds. You're all the way out to 15 seconds before your LEL sensor and your oxygen sensor give you a quantitative reading. This becomes critical if you're not taking the time to wait for an answer. And so we have to really wait for that answer, especially when we're talking about the explosivity in the oxygen, because that can be telling us whether everything else is working or not. Now, we also have our CO, chlorine, and hydrogen sulfide sensors, which take around 30 to 35 seconds for the response, followed by ammonia at the 60 seconds, sulfur dioxide around 75 seconds, and then, of course, our hydrogen cyanide at 200 seconds. So I'm going to turn it over to Scott to talk a little bit about the suicides first.
So what we're going to talk about is kind of the common ways, unfortunately, that people use to take themselves out. But these are what we're going to, the next couple ones we're going to be talking about are often easily made. So in some cases, they're binary, so you just need 2 different materials and they can produce a response to be able to do that. And for those to have a negative effect with them. So these are some headlines that have been recently taken out of the news to talk a little bit further from that. But if you can go to the next slide.
And so I just wanted to bring up here that sodium nitrate, I put this one thing here for Amazon here. Amazon also got sued for selling sodium nitrate. The real issue here with sodium nitrate is that people use it for other purposes, but now it's being used for the suicide box. Back over to you, Scott.
So what you're seeing, yes, thank you. So you're seeing some of the samples of what so you understand what some of these materials look like if you're coming in contact with them. As we said, you can buy them, find them fairly easily. In some cases, some of the materials we'll talk about, you can easily get at Lowe's or Home Depot or even Walmart, and Amazon has a number of these. They tend to have a little bit broader spectrum of things that you can buy to be able to do there. But in this case, you're talking with sodium nitrite that it's water soluble, and that asphyxia is kind of the common ways of going from there. But you can also see in many of these suicide agents, a lot of times they'll mix an anti-nausea drug. So in that case, what they're trying to do is make sure it takes effect. So if you're ingesting these, you don't want to vomit it back up. It kind of defeats the whole purpose, and then you have a really bad day because you're sick but not taking yourself out. So they sometimes do that. So it wouldn't be uncommon for you to see the combination of those two things put together at the same time.
And the one
Next
thing to
slide, please.
recognize for folks is that the color that you'll see of the body will be very different. When we see somebody who has died from a regular suicide or something, you often see that discoloration in the blues and grays of the body. With this, because it's binding to your blood, the iron in your blood, the blood turns actually a chocolate brown. And so you end up getting a liver mortis that is more browns and almost like a greenish color and tan. So I liken it to looking at somebody who's in camo, but they're not dressed.
Yeah, I've seen some videos of what someone looks like after exposure, and it's a little freaky with that, but that looks very like a Halloweenish response with them. But the methods that you can use from the standpoint of this is Raman and FTI are really good from a bulk detection standpoint of there. So one of the nice things about sodium nitrite from a first responder standpoint is there's less of a threat. So you aren't going to have a vapor threat that can take you out fairly quickly or build up in a small space. This tends to occur with some of the other materials like hydrogen sulfide or hydrogen cyanide to be able to do there. So AP4C will be very good for being able to use that, but if it's in powder form, you'll have to use the S4PE or the S4PF that we showed, introduce heat, and then you'll get a hit on the H&O channel with these materials to be able to do there when they're in solid form. Next slide, please. The next one we're going to talk about is hydrogen sulfide. So this is a recent occurrence that was out. So this is a picture of a woman's car. So she was a psychologist in Manhattan, and she, from all the information that we have, she ended up committing suicide inside her car on a Sunday morning. What they found on the front seat was Brant lime, so lime sulfur. So lime sulfur is something you can buy at Lowe's and Home Depot. It's a common powder that you put on vegetables, for example, to keep bugs away from them. And so if you simply introduce that an acid to that, like hydrochloric or sulfuric acid, it'll produce hydrogen sulfide and pretty high concentration. So in this case, there was a report of a woman passed out in her car. So first responders in the form of 2 police officers and an EMS opened up the door, and they were immediately exposed. One of them had to be taken to the hospital, but all 3 had symptoms of exposure. And so especially when you're in a car or a small confined space, an apartment, and they're doing these, that it's not uncommon to get very high concentrations of this material. Now, in the case of hydrogen sulfide, it does have a nice, I wouldn't sell nice, but a distinctive rotten egg smell associated with it. One of the challenges, if it's at a really high concentration, we can get what's called odor paralysis, where we just can't smell it anymore. And so that does create problems, but at lower concentrations, you should be able to smell it. And so that obviously has effects. It is flammable and heavier than air, so you also need to take that into consideration. Now, if it's obviously at a high concentration, you'll be able to detect it. If it's at a lower concentration, it's heavier than air, you need to get your detectors down lower than the source in order to be able to best detect it and determine concentration levels. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. So what we're seeing here is we'll be presenting it on multiple materials. So Your PEL on hydrogen sulfide is 20 ppm, and the ideal H is around 100 ppm. So your range of information that you're most looking for is in that area. So your PIDs and your E cells will give you a pretty good coverage over the main areas of interest to be able to do that. AP4C is very sensitive for hydrogen sulfide in particular, and so it'll be down in the ppb range, low ppm range to be able to do that. So it's much better use for verification of proper decon that's been done and validation of that. An additional thing that you have to take into consideration with hydrogen sulfide, especially because it's been inhaled, is that the person that has succumbed to it or still has it will be off-gassing it, and it'll still be in their lungs. So you need to aspirate, put oxygen through the lungs to try and clear that out, because you can bring that person, even though they're no longer living, they can still off-gas and infect, impact people. So you need to obviously clear and decon the body. And so just don't forget about the lungs. So the AP4C is a really good, because it's very sensitive. It'll let you know, fairly fast response time to be able to see what's going on if they're still off-gassing and they've been properly deconned. Next slide. So this will give you kind of your detectors to be able to do as we talked about. So for your hot zone, your PIDs as well as your E cells are good indicators of that. Obviously, your 20 to around 100 ppm range is kind of your sweet spot as far as trying to determine between PEL and ideal H. But if it's a really high concentration, it's obviously very important to understand, because you're also getting to the point of combustion for some of these materials, so you have to be very careful with them. So there's a variety of tools that you can use in your arsenal to be able to do that. Just be careful and understand that hydrogen sulfide is cross-sensitive to a number of other materials. So it'll get hits on, depending on what channels you have on your PIDs. They can hit on multiple channels, so just be cognizant of that with it. And the nice thing about AP4C is if you're dealing with an unknown response, so you couldn't smell the hydrogen sulfide, you aren't sure, it gives you an indication, because of the sulfur channel versus HCN channel will be different, versus the phosphine channel will be different as well. So because they're cross-sensitive to multiple channels of these E cells, the AP4C will give you some indication on what exactly family it is you're dealing with. FTIR is also another good source for identification and validation of that.
And one of the things that I like about the E cells here, and I said in the very beginning, I actually like cross sensitivities. So in this case, if I'm trying to measure hydrogen sulfide and I want to confirm it using a different, let's call it a battery, then I can use the carbon monoxide one, the ammonia one, the hydrogen cyanide one, the chlorine one, the phosphine one. All of those different cells that you can buy will also measure hydrogen sulfide. So I start looking at them and say, well, let me confirm it using my AP4C on sulfur channel, my PID, and then another electrochemical cell. Now I have multiple ways of detecting that chemical and confirming its concentration. So makes it so that it provides us with, for hydrogen sulfides, one of those chemicals like ammonia, where we have great detection all the way across the realm of need.
Next slide. So we're going to continue on the same thing, the same suicide agents. In this case, we're moving to hydrogen cyanide. So it is a colorless, extremely poisonous and flammable gas, and it's also very commonly used to do either suicides or to purposely take people out that you don't like associated with that. So targeted assassinations with it, because of its being kind of a colorless gas. A lot of times people may not see or get any warning ahead of it until it's too late. As well as going to the next slide, and you can see these are all current things, April and January. There have been a number of documentation on how to create purposeful or WND levels of these types of reactions. So if you can generate enough of it, you can start to impact more than just one person as far as a targeted assassination to a larger thing. And it doesn't, and again, these are primarily binary agents, so you don't need really complex chemistry. You don't need to be really a chemistry expert, and the materials that you can get are relatively common, and they can be, purchased in a variety of different sources without raising any sort of flags associated with that. And then so it's just a matter of how much reaction you can occur and how many people that you can impact from some of these. Next slide, please. So as far as the detection range we're talking, it's fairly similar to, or has some similarities to what we talked about with your hydrogen sulfide, but your PEL is around 10 parts per million. Your IDLH is 50 parts per million for that. So you're kind of your sweet spot. You want to detect from a little bit below your 10 up to your 50. So you have a number of different options that are working well for you. As we talked about before, the eCell gives you information from a really large range of that. The AP4C is also a really good detector from that. So 1 bar on the detector is less than PEL. 2 bars will get you above PEL, and 3 bars above 3 bars will be above IDLH. So it's kind of a good, quick, fast indicator of hydrogen cyanide, and it'll hit on the HNO channel associated with that. And then as well as your PIDs will also be working from that. And for verification, an FTIR will give you a validation of hydrogen cyanide actual gas. Next slide, please. Again, this is kind of hitting on what we talked about.
Sorry, we're losing you again, Scott.
Oh.
I'll go through this slide right here.
Okay. Go ahead.
Okay, so in the hot zone, the AP4C is providing you that benefit all the way across the range of need and actually above it. So we try to get up to 50 parts per million, and we can actually go up to 158 here. If we need to go higher, we've got to rely on our combustible gas indicator, or what you might call your LEL sensor, which will start off at its 0.1% at around 350, at 1%, sorry, at 350 parts per million. For confirmation for decon and ventilation, we can still use that AP4C because it gets down well below our concentration of interest of the 10 parts per million. And the other one, which is pretty unique, and I'll actually run this video now so you can see it happening. This is the Explore IR from Red Wave, and you can see that with 10 parts per million of hydrogen cyanide coming across, you can actually start to see it. And so even at that confirmed decon ventilation, you can uniquely identify hydrogen cyanide by using this method as well. And so if you haven't had a chance to see that, this is your hydrogen cyanide sample coming through with a gas phase infrared. And so it takes about 30 seconds to run. The other tools that you can use, like Scott said, were your electrochemical cells. But we have to remember that our electrochemical cells end up giving us a lot of time lag. So we have about 200 seconds response time that we have to play around with here. Now, I'm going to go into some of the pesticides. So we've had a couple of events recently, and why I'm really focused on the pesticides was that the weaponization of them. So in December down in Mexico, there was a daisy chain of carbamate pesticides that were being put together as an operational device. And so very simple design, but it was just small sticks of dynamite attached to carbamate pesticides to release them. That is reminiscent of what happened in Brazil in June, where, and I'll show some of this video, where they had a UAV that was an agricultural UAV that had 2 liters of a mixture of different farming chemicals, which were pesticides, as well as we'll just call it excreta, but spraying over the crowd. Now, this was in a political rally, so this was a rival to the political person that was having the event. At first, people felt the spray overhead and thought it was more for cooling until they started to get the smell associated with it over time. And then they started to evacuate and get out of there. But reality is, we have now had a couple of instances where we've had agricultural UAVs spraying chemicals into areas where we have a problem. And now the real big problem we have here is these are generally aerosols, not gases. And so most of our detectors that we use in a trace detection context cannot measure aerosols. So think about that on the front end of all of your detectors. If you have that small filter, it's blocking all aerosols from getting through. So the only two that you really have for aerosols are going to be your MX908 or your AP4C. Now, I put in here the two most common, in the USA at least, pesticides or insecticides that we're seeing in residential use are carbaryl and propoxur. And in this case, they come in as aerosol threats. We can measure them with the AP4C, but in most cases, we're measuring it above where it is toxic. So it is going to be something that we can measure, but we're not going to measure it below 26 milligrams per cubic meter of the aerosol. Still is going to provide us that early warning to know that we're being exposed, but we may actually start to exhibit some symptoms. We're measuring well below lethality, which is fantastic. So people are going to get out, they're going to be responded to, but the problem is going to come in that you may start to see those symptoms. Remember, your sludgem, so salivation, lacrimation, urination, defecation, gastrointestinal distress, and then your meiosis, your pinpointed pupils. So a lot of these things. The interesting thing seen a lot of is that most of these materials actually have some type of vomiting agent in them as well. Ensure that if you were to ingest larger amounts that you were due for a chemical suicide, that you'll actually vomit up the material. Now, if we're talking about the agricultural sprayers, the likelihood is generally aldicarb as one of those materials. The nice thing here is that we can measure it at pretty low levels, but remembering that we're not really getting quantitative at this point because we're talking about an aerosol threat. Now, the MX908 can also measure this using its aero module, remembering that that one's going to have a bit of a lag in time because it's going to collect sample over about a minute's time frame, and then it's going to thermally desorb that sample off. But you're still going to get a pretty unique identification in a relatively short time frame. And in its new pesticide module, it does have aldicarb and carbaryl. Doesn't have all of them, but does have some of the ones of high interest. Now, if you can get bulk enough material, then you can use your Raman and infrared for detection as well. Now, I put this one in here because this was just last week down here in Florida where I live. So just south of me down Pompano Beach. There was a fumigation event that was happening at one of the Bears furniture stores. And in this case, there were 3 employees that did the fumigation. And these were not employees of Bears, they were employees of an insecticide company. One of the employees was feeling ill that evening and went to the hospital. They ended up checking on the other 2 employees just as due diligence and found that one was dead in his vehicle and the other one was actually sick and ended up passing away as well. And so the one who went to the hospital was the one who had the least amount of damage and is still living. The other 2 ended up dying. And at this point in time, there's a little bit of confusion as to what were the materials. So autopsies and different medical things going on right now. But I just put in a little bit about sulfurofluoride, which is one of the likely materials that it could have been. And the issue that we have with sulfurofluoride, it is the most common insecticide that we're using in spray applications today. But the problem is that we don't have very many ways to detect it. So if we're talking about it used as a gas, then we really are down to using our AP4C or our colorimetric tubes. And the colorimetric tubes, while working great, take about 3 minutes. There's 6 strokes and they go between 1 and 5 parts per million. So they're getting just down below where we are with permissible exposure limits or some of our others. The short-term exposure limit of 10 parts per million is well above anything we measure. So we are still providing the ability to detect, to warn. But what we're going to have is that you're going to have to protect a little bit earlier from detect to protect than what you would do in most cases, because we have no way to actually quantify the higher levels. So what's going to happen is you can quantify with the AP4C up to about 2 parts per million. If you wait the 3 minutes on the colorimetric tube, you can go up to about 5 parts per million. So it's probably not worth the wait. Just stick with the 2 seconds and say, once you go above 2 and you start to see that sulfur channel, all 5 bars starting to flash, or if you get the 5 bars flashing and then 1 red bar in each of your 4 channels and the CH channel, you'll end up saying, hey, I've overloaded the system. And that will show you that you have gone above that 2 parts per million, and you are now in a point where you need to have respiratory protection of some sort. And that's going to be your early warning for sulfurofluoride. Otherwise, we have no other way of detecting that today. So in the hot zone, it's going to be above all your instrument ranges. So you're going to have to set your zone based upon permissible exposure limits at this point, because we have no other way to measure higher. When we do the decontamination, which is generally going to be ventilation, enhanced ventilation, then we're going to be measuring at using the AP4C and trying to get them down to about 1 bar, which is going to be down in the lower parts per billion range. We can use FTIR to verify the threat. The nice thing with the new Explore IR, that can get down to about 3 parts per million with unique identification. So you could go in there and tell right away what material is being used, and it was right there at that permissible exposure limit. And then of course the colorimetric tubes as well. The Explore IR would take probably about a minute to get enough sample to get you that reading, but still unique identification. Now, this one's an old one. So the ones that we were talking about earlier were things that just happened. The reason I put this one in is because the headline was yesterday. And the headline came out about 16 million that DuPont has agreed to pay as a fine over a 2014 accident that killed several workers. And so one of the things I wanted to remind you here is everybody should be following the Chemical Safety Board page. So when these reports come out, they provide you a really nice review of all the different things that occurred and examples and information for both facilities and for the first responder on how can you do things better if this were to happen again. And so just providing that guidance. So in this case, I put this one in because it gave us a little chance to do some modeling as well. So there was about 24,000 pounds of methyl mercaptan released from this insecticide production unit at the DuPont facility in La Porte, Texas. The issue that happened was that before people realized that it was actually a release of methyl mercaptan, they had all kinds of alarms going off, but they were kind of ignoring the alarms because they knew they had a pressure building up because of a plug in their system. And so they were going in and testing. Unfortunately, the folks that went in did not have respiratory protection because they thought that the increase in pressure was due to something else, not from the methyl mercaptan itself. So that 24,000 pounds of material, which is a tremendous amount, happened with the release happened about over 3 hours time. And that will explain why I did a little bit different in the model. So I went back and pulled up the weather information from that in 2014 to get my model set and went through and found the wind speed, the temperature profiles. This all happened in the early hours of the morning, just shy of 4 a.m. So I wanted to get the right numbers and things to put into my model and see if we could get something that was comparable. So what I did here was, if you're not familiar with the Chemical Emergency Response e-service program, that is a free model based upon Aloha. That is from a company called Vlahi, V-L-A-H-I. And so you can go on there and you can download their model, and you can actually also do the web-based. This is the web-based version. And so what I put in here was a leak of 133 pounds per minute coming out of a continuous leak. I put it in for the 60-minute duration, which is the length of time Aloha can run. And so that gave me 133 pounds per minute release with a total amount of about 8,000 pounds. Remember, only doing the first hour, so 24,000 pounds was 3 hours. So I just did it as if it was equally done 8 hours, 8,000 pounds per hour. Picked the chemical as methyl mercaptan. And what I did first was just set it up so it was giving me my zones that I would do based upon my ideal H at 150 parts per million, my OSHA levels for permissible exposure limit of 10, and then my recommended TLVs of 0.5. And so what I did here was just plot this down on the map for the area. And this is all done using the software. And what it showed us is, even though in the beginning, the DuPont company did not feel that the material was going to leave their site, you can see that, yes, your ideal H level pretty well stayed within their area. But once we started getting out to that permissible exposure limit and then the recommended exposure limits, they went out quite a ways, and they did it within minutes. And so you had about 5 minutes, you were well outside of that area, where it was a mile away from the factory. And as we start going in, you'll start seeing other information periods. So what I did here is just went through and said, if I had my AP4, this one is the PID. So if I went out and did the PID, and for examples throughout this presentation, your PID cross sensitivity and correction factors and your electrochemical cell ones, I use the Honeywell Ray detectors because that's what I'm most used to. So in this case, if I was looking for ideal H, which is 150 parts per million, and I was using a Honeywell Ray PID 3000, my screen reading would be 278 parts per million. Same thing down below. If I was looking at the 10 parts per million level, my screen would say 18.5. And then over here for that lower exposure standard, the time weighted average of 0.5, then my screen reading would be 0.9. And that's just using your correction factors and making sure that we can get that information. The limited detection for the instrument will be around 0.05 parts per million or 50 parts per billion for the PID on methyl mercaptan. So really nice and sensitive. On the AP4C, that LOD is going to be very close. The permissible exposure limit and the ideal H will be over the level of interest, though. So when you do your ideal H, you're actually going to have all 5 bars red and flashing, which is going to be the same thing as permissible exposure limit. When we get down to the recommended exposure limits, where it drops down to about 3 bars, and that allows us to get really good detail at the low level here. So I'm going to use my PID for the higher levels, and I'm going to use my AP4C for the lower levels for that level of detail I'm looking for. Now, I also ran the plumes and did it based upon evacuation distances. If we were looking at this from an operational perspective, thinking we might have to evacuate people, remembering that when this event occurred, DuPont unintentionally, however, they did not think that the material left their site. But based upon the numbers and the information that was put forth after the investigation, you can see that it actually went out quite a ways. Within about that first hour was already out about 6 miles from the plant at levels that were still of interest. Now, there are levels where we would have sheltered people in place. There would have been levels where the long-term effects would not have been problematic. People would have had issues, asthmatics and susceptible populations would have had some issues higher than others, but still would have allowed us to leave people in place and then monitor carefully. So what we would have done here is that the PID would have been used for those safety zones. I also would have said that if it was above 10% of the LEL, probably would not have allowed anybody to enter that area. Unfortunately, people did enter that area and they did not get overcome by the LEL issue, the flammability, but we did have, there were several people that died, so they were well over the lethal limit with no respiratory protection. The PIDs and the AP4C can be used to measure the community exposure, but they're never going to be able to reach that 5 parts per billion for mild health effects. But they are able to easily see the 23 parts per million for the serious health effects. And what that was doing is saying, we can make sure that people are not going to get serious health effects, but that transient effect of mild, we weren't able to get low enough level. So again, those limits of detection for the instruments are going to be around 50 to 80 parts per billion in about 1 to 2 seconds. So allowing you to provide some really good operational guidance. that yesterday, and it really kind of jumped out at me. One of the reasons I went through and started looking at the lithium ion batteries here was that I had gotten a call at one point. I think it might have been Scott that called and said that why were they measuring on the phosphorus channel with some of these battery incidents? And reality is with a lithium ion battery, when they go bad pretty quickly and pretty impressively. Now, I have no idea what language this is in, so if the sound comes through, let me just turn that coming out of this. This were occurring near me. But you can see as each one of the battery cells blows, you'll actually get a shooting coming out the side of releasing of not only the electrolyte, but the gases that have built up inside that cell. Now, that's going to start to reach a level that is flammable. You've got a lot of organic materials that are coming out there as well. And once it reaches that flammable range, you go outside for a minute, you can actually hear the pop in the video. But now this has actually gone on and is on fire. The issue we're worrying about from this perspective is not the fire, okay? But nice to see that you can actually get some of your material spraying out when you have those jet fires. But what I ended up doing here was just looking through at all of the different information available. And what we had is that lithium ion batteries do produce a material that will become problematic, and it will be measured on the phosphorus channel. We all worry about the hydrogen fluoride that is produced, but in this case, the phosphorofluoride might actually be even worse. This is part of that material that was coming out ahead of the flaming of those batteries. So what I did here was just show you that phosphorofluoride will start measuring. 1 bar is going to be between 2 and 4 parts per billion. And then as you go up, we're going to get 4 to 20, 20 to 99, 99 to 493, and then 5 bars is going to be greater than 493 parts per billion. And so from that perspective, we can measure the phosphorofluoride very low. You might be actually measuring this instead of some of your HF stuff and just knowing that based upon the material, we should be getting 2 times the HF of what we're getting in terms of our phosphorus-based materials based upon the science. Okay, so this is allowing us to measure the phosphorofluoride coming out of those batteries. So then I started looking at it and saying, well, what about all the other batteries? How can our AP4C or other detectors help us here? So I went back through and just looked at the different battery types that we're generally using. So most of us, we still have tons of our primary alkaline batteries, or those batteries that we have in, let's say, our mouse that we're using. A lot of those are primary alkaline batteries, have potassium, like 65%. For that, what you end up seeing, remember how the electrodes there, and be able to measure a lot of that just with your pH paper. So wet your pH paper, electrodes, see if you're getting anything. But when it goes bad, when that primary alkaline battery is in its neglect phase, you can actually use a CO sensor and it releases hydrogen gas. And so that CO sensor from electrochemical, remember, 30-second response time, but it's going to measure positive for hydrogen gas coming off of it. It won't be immediate. You're going to see with a little bit of delay. But that's going to be your indication that the primary alkaline battery is going bad. When we get to our lithium metal batteries, remember, these are our water reactive batteries. We have a lot of confusion between lithium metal and lithium ion, but lithium metal batteries are actually the ones that have the water reactive material in them. The good and bad of this is by the time you have a lithium metal battery fire, the first units on scene are going to see a fire and they're going to put water on it to put the fire out. What that does is burn up the rest of the lithium. So reality is trying to find ways around putting out a lithium metal battery fire with water. Just use the water. It'll use up the lithium pretty quickly. Now, you can also measure the hydrochloric coming out of those with pH paper. It would have to be wetted because it's going to be a gas-based hydrochloric. but the AP4C will measure the sulfur dioxide coming out on the sulfur channel. So when a lithium metal battery is going bad in terms of a detector, you're going to see sulfur channel positive. You'll also see bromine and chlorine coming out of this. These will likely hit your pH paper and bleach it white. So if your pH paper changes to give you an acidic pH and then all of a sudden starts going white, it's bleaching the dye of the paper. And so that would be an indicator of your bromine and chlorine. Now, the next type that we still see a ton of are our lead acid batteries. We have both wet batteries and the more common dry batteries, and they release different things. So on the wet battery, you would see hydrogen coming off with your CO sensor. So use your carbon monoxide electrochemical cell. And then on AP4C, you're going to see two different channels hitting here. The sulfur channel is going to be both sulfur dioxide and sulfide coming out. The arsenic channel will hit for the arsenic hydride or arsine. Okay, antimony hydride will also be released, but we don't have an easy way of detecting that unless we use tubes, and that'll just take too much time. If it's a dry battery, so more of our what we're seeing today in a lot of our cells are dry cells, so that the battery side, the material's not free-flowing acid in there, it's actually in a gel or into a matrix. In those batteries, they will give off hydrogen sulfide coming out of the sulfur channel. So you see it on the sulfur channel there. So again, just hydrogen sulfide, but you'll see arsenic as well as sulfur up here on the wet ones, as well as the hydrogen coming off. So I put that kind of into a little table here to say, if I have some type of battery and I want to determine what type it is, and it's going bad, my alkaline batteries, I'm not going to see anything on my AP4C. But I will see the hydrogen on my CO sensor. Okay, when I get to my lithium metal batteries, the sulfur is going to go off. My lead acid is going to give me arsenic and sulfur. My secondary lead acid for dry is just going to give me sulfur again. And then my lithium ions are going to give me phosphorus. So the nice thing here is I can tell you right away whether it's lithium ion because of the phosphorus channel. I can tell you whether it's a wet lead acid battery because of that arsenic and sulfur channel going off. The issue I will have is whether it's a primary lithium metal battery or a secondary lead acid, telling those apart. And to do that, and so playing a battery you have that's going bad based upon the different things here. And what started us down this path were two different things. First was the fact that people were having lithium ion batteries go bad and we're seeing phosphorus in the gases, and that should be expected. The other one was a call, it's actually probably 2 years ago now at least, from San Diego County, where they were on a recycling fire or recycling issue, and they were getting both arsenic and sulfur hitting on the channel. And what had happened was not only were they getting the arsenic and sulfur from the lead acid battery, but the lead acid battery was releasing the sulfuric acid and it was dripping down onto some computer boards. And remember that old computer boards also have arsenic on them. So you're having the small amount of arsenic coming from the battery, but the higher amount was actually coming from the reaction of the sulfuric that was released and was dripping onto the computer boards. So we just had them move those two things apart from one another, contain the sulfuric acid, neutralize it, and the incident was over. And it was really because they were saying, well, why are we seeing arsenic here? It doesn't make any sense. It does make sense when you start thinking about some of the different components inside of the batteries. So that was the last one I was going to show you. And reality is, just wanted to remind everybody that for all the different calls we have today, when we're talking about that first in detectors, we need things that are fast. We end up relying heavily on our AP4C or our flame spectrophotometer and our PIDs. The next line is going to our electrochemical cells, just remembering to keep in mind what their response time is. In terms of some of these calls, understanding their cross sensitivities, and I like to make a table of all of those and just know where they are and what they are. will provide you with a lot of information. And then, of course, don't forget those papers and things. We have things like just pH paper that people don't really think about how much information it's giving us. M8 paper, yes, it's supposed to be used for chemical warfare agents, but reality is it can tell us pretty quickly if something's organic or water-based. Organic soaks into the paper, whereas the water-based rolls off. And we start thinking about those things in context, and it provides us a lot more information. Now, as we get those bulk materials, I think we've all been very lucky since Ahura in 2001 came out with the first handheld Raman system. And we have been working with portable Raman and infrared systems in the field now for many years, back to the Travel IR and Sense IR systems for infrared, and of course Ahura as the beginner of the Raman. That allowed us to get that unique identification for bulk samples in the field as well. And then, of course, don't forget for any of these high hazard systems like the pesticides, you'll still have instruments like your MX908 that can help you through those. And the last one that we did bring up a couple of times today was the Explore IR, which is the new gas phase infrared coming out of RedWave, which will also be something to help you start looking at these. Remember, that's not really quantitative, that's going to be qualitative, but it will give you a unique identification. So hopefully the things that we covered today were of interest to everybody. We did record this session, so you will receive an email after the event that'll tell you how to get to your recorded sessions if you want to watch or look at any of these pieces again. I'm sorry we were having some technical difficulty with some of our sound coming through. I saw it happen several times. It's not even windy today, so it's the infrastructure, I'm sure, but today in Florida, it's sunny. So I want to say thank you and turn it back over to Scott, and thank you all for joining us today. Scott?
Yeah, can you hear me all right?
Yep.
All right, good. Yeah, again, apologies for some of the audio. It was going in and out, and I don't really know what the cause of that was, since I have a good response as well, and it's relatively sunny here in Virginia as well. So we did want to open up if there are any questions that people might have that came up to mind or things that weren't clear. You can actually write those questions in, and I don't know if we have anyone wrote any through those, but a lot of times we like to go through there. And if you have one that comes across, just feel free to write it on the little panel on the side, and we'll try and answer it for you.
Most of it was okay.
Go ahead.
Most of it was that we had sound issues, but I do see Justin put in, we have seen HazMat contractors using Quickcrete to solidify and cap the reaction of the chemical suicide solution in the container. What are your thoughts, and would you recommend this technique for the HazMat team? And what would this method work on the other chemical suicides? So yes, the Quickcrete method is one that has been evaluated pretty well. It's been evaluated well with EPA and some others as well. And that is specific to the hydrogen sulfide suicides. And what's happening here is the Quickcrete is acting as the neutralizing agent for the sulfuric acid or whatever acid is being used in the event. Keep in mind, when you add that Quickcrete, if you haven't done this before, it gets really hot. Okay, it's a neutralization reaction, and it will foam quite a bit. So when you do that, you pour the quick concrete in with stirring to this residual solution, and then you allow that to slide. That generally takes overnight. So you've got quite a while to wait for that to slip. Have household hazardous waste, just regular household waste that you can throw away. So it becomes a concrete block. The lime material, lime sulfur, is in there still, which is still something we use all the time on plants. And then we have neutralized all of the sulfuric acid, and now you just have a solid block of waste that you throw in the dumpster. And so that is one of the issues. Scott, I'm going to throw over to you on the intrinsic safety. So is the AP4C intrinsically safe? Yes and no. I know that just because you have that whole system on the front to keep that flame from ever outside. But
yeah, so we test every device before it leaves the factory in a flammable environment, and we make sure that nothing propagates outside of the detector. We do not, so the certification processes will vary depending upon your jurisdiction. One of the things we do not have on the device presently is a battery disconnect. So we do not, so if you pulled out the battery in the back, you could potentially get a spark, and that could, operate that device unsafe. So the answer to your question is we don't have it certified, but we do test every device, and it's not allowed to leave the factory inside in a flammable environment. So what we have in your primary concern would be propagating something outside of the detector. So we do have that pre-chamber on the device, so that does keep all materials from being able to do that. So and we do have a hydrocarbon channel on the device as well to let you know that you are operating in a flammable environment to be able to do that. But we don't have the certification, but I've brought the device downrange when I was in a flammable environment. I just obviously didn't play with the battery in order to do that. So it feels safe using it, but we do not have it certified.
Okay, and then Ben had a comment here, which completely concur with. I wanted to share that a drone pilot that a UAV, a drone pilot that uses a UAV using agriculture sprayer is going to be a larger drone with a high weight payload capability. That is absolutely correct. The pilot would also be closer to the target because of the release of the aerosol. I don't know one of the ones that I've been using that's an agriculture drone. You actually can be quite a distance away and just put in where you want it to spray using your iPad, and so you guys kind of map the area, so you can have them close and far away, but it is a large one. And generally speaking, most of these, if you look at the drone, you can actually see underneath it where they actually have that payload. Another one from Gerald: do you know of any application using the different cross sensitivities to extend sensor range? You mentioned the CO versus H2 example, but is there something using a multi-gas sensor box with various EC sensors and using cross sensitivities to increase range of the box to other gases or increase confidence level by comparing responses of different sensors? I don't know as if there's a commercial thing doing that, but we do that every day in the field. That is something that I have all of our teams use. And so if you go into the emergency response decision support system, our software, you can actually go through and figure out what the cross sensitivities are and use those to your advantage. And so that is something that we teach in every one of our detection classes. So I don't know if it needs to be in one single box, but it is something that you can create the matrix yourself of which sensors you have, and then figure out all the different things it can detect. And it's something I highly recommend you do, because it will provide you with a huge benefit and enhancement to your current capabilities that you may not realize you have already in place. And then Ben, this would be a larger drone than what you would normally see. Absolutely. The drones that we see that people are always thinking about that are like these personal, small, tiny drones, those are not what we usually consider for a spraying payload of an aerosol. These drones are several feet across usually, just to get the sprayers and things on them. So the actual drone itself may not be that big, but the sprayers and all of those things do become quite interesting. And they're quite large. Quick question on Gerald. Since I'm from Europe, is the software you mentioned available for us as well? Gerald, it is. If you are depending upon the country, if you send me an email, I can help you figure out if it is available to you. It is available to first responders and military personnel in the US and partner countries, because it is controlled, unclassified information contained within the software. And all those pictures you saw of the different screen things were all out of that software. Kawika Hughes, lithium battery ion fire mitigation strategy. That is a whole class in itself. We go through, we teach classes that are all day long on lithium battery fires, and it's really dependent upon the area that you're in and what you're dealing with. Reality is, if you don't have to try to fight the fire for a lithium ion battery, oftentimes you're better off to let it go and let it burn itself out. That's often the fastest resolution you'll get for a lithium battery ion is just lithium ion battery is just to let it burn. Now, that's not always suitable. So there are many times where you need to temporarily put out the fire. And I say temporarily because almost all the solutions we have uh, are things that will only temporarily solve the problem. And so it's really going to be until that battery has released all of its energy, you're going to still be fighting a problem. So the issue will be figuring out when. I don't know where, Kawika, you're out of, but we do classes on this one all the time. I know Ray was on here. Ray Herring is one of the ones who teaches a lot of these classes as well. But lithium ion battery fires are really interesting. I do like to put in, you may have to use a significant amount of water. Just remember that all of these videos that we keep seeing about all these great solutions for putting out the battery fires, just notice that they're all doing it with the battery outside of the casing. And so when we have these lithium ion battery fires and the lithium ion battery is still within a casing, if the water or whatever solution or solvent they're putting on it is not getting inside the casing with the actual problem, then you're still not putting it out. You're just prolonging it or giving you a temporary solution to a long-term problem. I found that trying to put it out takes many hours versus letting it burn itself out or moving it to an area where it can burn itself out is a much faster response. Again, not always what you can do. Ricky, a good key for drone recognition are the number of arms on the drone. Very good. I didn't think about that. The more arms, the heavier the payload, the bigger the threat. Yes, absolutely. And I never thought of it that way, but that is a fantastic way to look at it. When you're looking up and see that drone, if you see many arms coming off of it, you've definitely got something with a heavier payload. So if it's a small drone with a lot of arms, just be careful, because that to me would be thinking about explosives. But when we get to some of these with the big, broader arms that also have a sprayer on them, those are the ones that we're talking about for the aerosol-based release of chemicals, which is a fantastic capability for farmers for getting that material out when they need it, but also has a lot of dual use. With that, right now, I think Ricky's was our last comment or question. So I think we will go ahead and say thank you. Just one thing that I want to remind everybody is that we will send you, if you want a certificate for the course, we will send you a certificate, because this course does cover a lot of the didactic portions of the OSHA 1910-120 for our American friends, and NFPA 470, which a lot of you may know as NFPA 472 and 1072. It covers a lot of the different specifications there. So we have them listed out on the certificate if you need to have that for your training purposes. So thank you everybody again. And for any of you who are going to be out in the Midwest region this week, we will, Proengin and Luke from Proengin and myself will be at the Midwest HazMat conference. So if you get a chance to stop by, that's a fantastic, it's one of our favorite conferences. So stop in, visit with us, and if you have questions, we can sit down and go into them further. And if you didn't have a chance to ask your question and want to get more information, please feel free to email Scott and I. Our emails are above, but you could also get us through that link that came out with the webinar information. So thank you, stay safe, and have a wonderful day.